The TSA agent barely glanced up when the old man approached security. Faded jeans, worn blue flannel shirt, a small carry-on bag slung over his shoulder. Just another passenger. Until the metal detector started screaming. "Step back, sir," the agent barked irritably. The old man quietly stepped backward. Items from his pockets, a weathered leather wallet, a few quarters, wire-rimmed glasses held together with tape. The detector went off again. "What else you got in there?" the agent demanded, his tone sharper now. "Nothing, son," the old man said quietly. That's when everyone missed what was really there. As the man raised his arms, the slight bulge beneath his shirt, the barely noticeable hollow on the left side of his chest, and nobody had noticed the metal prosthetic replacing his right leg below the knee. Terminal B at Denver International Airport was bustling with its usual morning chaos. 7:30 a.m. on a Tuesday in November, and travelers rushed to catch their flights to destinations across America. The scent of Starbucks coffee mixed with the sound of rolling luggage wheels and constant gate announcements echoing through the concourse. Business travelers clutched their laptops, families juggled strollers and diaper bags, and college students slouched against pillars with oversized backpacks. In this mayhem, the old man didn't stand out. 73-year-old James Jim Mitchell was flying from Denver to Phoenix to visit his daughter Sarah and meet his new grandson for the first time. One small carry-on bag, simple clothes, and a quiet demeanor made him invisible among the crowds rushing to catch connecting flights to Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York. He'd driven to the airport in his 2008 Honda Civic, the same car he'd been driving for over a decade. No frills, no flash, just reliable transportation. The parking garage attendant had barely looked up when Jim handed him the $5 fee. Another invisible senior citizen in a world that moved too fast to notice. Jim had arrived 2 hours early, as he always did. Old military habits die hard, and he'd learned long ago that being early meant being prepared. He checked in at the kiosk, printed his boarding pass, and found a quiet corner near his gate to wait. He didn't read a magazine or scroll through his phone like the younger passengers. He simply sat and observed, watching the world move around him. When it came time for security, he gathered his things and joined the line like everyone else. No special treatment requested, no veteran status mentioned on his ticket. He showed his Colorado driver's license to the document checker, placed his bag on the conveyor belt, and walked toward the metal detector. It went off. Tyler Rodriguez, 26, had been working TSA for 8 months since graduating from Colorado State University with a criminal justice degree. The early morning shift and repetitive procedures had made him impatient and mechanical. Student loans weighed on his mind, and he'd been hoping for a promotion that would help him afford a better apartment. He looked at the old man and thought to himself, "Great, another senior with keys or change he forgot about. This is going to slow everything down." Tyler had processed hundreds of passengers that morning already. Business travelers who knew the drill and moved efficiently through the line, families who took forever to organize their belongings, and elderly passengers who always seemed to forget something in their pockets. To him, they were all just obstacles between him and his lunch break. "Sir, I need you to empty all your pockets," Tyler said in a professional but cold tone, already reaching for his blue latex gloves. Jim Mitchell placed his belongings in the small plastic bin with methodical precision. Old leather wallet that had been with him since 1975, a few quarters for parking meters, his flip phone that his daughter kept telling him to upgrade, and wire-rimmed glasses that had seen better days. Each item placed carefully, quietly. He walked through the detector again, his gait slightly uneven but steady. The machine beeped again, its electronic screech cutting through the ambient noise of the terminal. Tyler's patience snapped. The line behind Jim was growing longer, and his supervisor was watching from across the checkpoint. "What else do you have? Belt? Watch? Jewelry? Come on, sir. We need to keep this line moving. None of that, Jim said quietly, his right hand unconsciously moving toward his knee for just a split second, a gesture so brief that nobody noticed except for one person. Then I'm gonna have to do a pat down, Tyler announced, his voice carrying enough volume that other passengers started paying attention. Some checked their watches, worried about missing their flights. A businessman in an expensive suit sighed audibly. A mother with 2 young children shifted uncomfortably, trying to keep her kids distracted. The pat-down began with Tyler, going through the motions he'd performed thousands of times: arms, torso, waistband. But when his hands moved down to check Jim's legs, something was wrong. His left hand hit Jim's right leg just below the knee, and instead of muscle and bone, he felt something hard, cold, and unmistakably artificial. Metal, titanium, a prosthetic. But instead of handling the discovery professionally, Tyler let his frustration get the better of him. "That's why it's going off," he announced loudly enough for everyone in the vicinity to hear. "Why didn't you tell me you had a prosthetic?" Jim said nothing. He'd been through this before at other airports, other security checkpoints. Some agents were professional about it. Others, like Tyler, made it into a spectacle. "Why didn't you tell me from the start?" Tyler added, making sure nearby passengers could hear his frustration. "You're holding up the whole line. We have procedures for this kind of thing." That's when Sergeant First Class Mike Torres, working the adjacent security lane, noticed the situation developing. At 52, Torres had served 2 tours in Afghanistan with the Army's 10th Mountain Division before transitioning to civilian airport security. He'd been wounded in an IED attack outside Kabul in 2009. And though his injuries weren't visible, he knew what it was like to carry the invisible scars of service. Torres had been watching his younger colleagues' behavior for weeks. Tyler was technically competent, but lacked the maturity and respect that came with experience. Today, something about the way the young agent was treating the elderly passenger struck a nerve. Jim quietly put his shoes back on, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He'd learned long ago that reacting to disrespect only made situations worse. Better to endure it silently and move on. "What's the problem here?" Torres asked as he approached, his voice carrying the authority of someone who dealt with real problems in real dangerous places. "Guy's got a prosthetic leg but didn't say anything up front," Tyler complained, still wearing his latex gloves and gesturing toward Jim like he was some kind of security threat. "Made me waste time with the whole pat-down routine." Torres looked carefully at the older man. Something about his posture caught his attention first. Straight back despite his age, feet positioned shoulder-width apart, hands loose at his sides but ready to move if necessary. It was a stance Torres recognized, the unconscious positioning of someone who'd been trained to respond to threats. Then he noticed other details. The way Jim's eyes were constantly scanning their surroundings, not nervously, but systematically. The way he stood perfectly still while being searched, not fidgeting or complaining like most passengers would. And there was something else, a faded tattoo barely visible at the man's wrist as he rolled up his sleeve. Torres squinted. It was hard to make out, sun-faded and weathered by decades, but he could just barely distinguish the outline of wings. U.S. Air Force wings, Sir Torres said respectfully, his entire demeanor changing. "Did you serve?" Jim looked up and met Torres's eyes. He saw understanding there, recognition from one veteran to another. The invisible brotherhood that connected those who'd worn the uniform. "Air Force," Jim said simply. 1970 to 95. The numbers hit Torres like a physical blow. Those weren't just dates. They were decades that spanned some of America's most critical military operations. Vietnam War, Cold War tensions,
the Iran hostage crisis, Grenada, Panama, the Gulf War, and calculating the man's age. Torres realized this guy had been flying combat missions during some of America's most dangerous and classified operations. "What did you fly?" Torres asked, his voice carrying genuine respect now. "F-4 Phantoms in Jim replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "F-16s asked of that. Out of Luke, Nellis, overseas deployments. I can't really talk about the overseas deployments." He couldn't talk about. Torres knew what that meant. Black operations, classified missions, the kind of stuff that didn't make it into history books or war movies. That's when it clicked for Torres. He'd heard stories in military circles, whispered conversations in VFW halls, and American Legion posts. Stories about an F-16 pilot who'd been shot down over Iraq during the Gulf War in '91, had lost his leg, but fought tooth and nail to get back in the cockpit. The Air Force had wanted to retire him, but he'd appealed, fought through medical boards, and somehow convinced them to let him return to active duty. The pilot who flew combat missions with a prosthetic leg had become something of a legend in fighter pilot communities. They called him Iron Leg, and Torres had heard his story told in hushed tones by other veterans, who spoke of him with the kind of reverence reserved for true warriors. "You are not Iron Leg Mitchell, are you?"
Welcome to Silent Heroes Stories. Before we continue this incredible moment of recognition and what happens next at Denver Airport, tell me in the comments what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories of quiet courage like Colonel Mitchell's deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. These silent heroes walk among us every single day. Jim just nodded once, barely perceptible, but it was enough. Torres immediately straightened, fighting every instinct to snap to attention and salute. His hands trembled slightly as the full weight of who he was standing next to hit him. This wasn't just any veteran. This was a living legend, a man whose story had inspired countless military personnel over the decades. "Tyler." Torres called to the younger TSA agent, his voice carrying an urgency that made several nearby passengers turn their heads. "Get over here, now." Tyler approached, still not understanding why his colleague seemed so agitated. He was still focused on getting through his shift, still thinking about the growing line of passengers and his supervisor's watchful eyes. "This gentleman," Torres said, his voice steady but carrying an undertone that made everyone within earshot pay attention, "spent 25 years defending this country in the cockpit of fighter jets. That prosthetic leg you were complaining about? He got it when his F-16 was shot down over Iraq in '91. After that, he fought through bureaucrats, doctors, and military review boards to get back in the cockpit and kept flying combat missions for his country." Torres paused, letting the words sink in. "You just treated a genuine American hero like he was some kind of security threat." Tyler's face went from confused to bright red in the span of about 3 seconds. "I didn't know. I mean, how was I supposed to?" "There's a lot you don't know," Torres said calmly, but firmly. "And you might never know, because men like Colonel Mitchell don't walk around advertising their service. They don't wear their medals to the grocery store or talk about their combat missions at barbecues. They just live with what they've done, quietly, with dignity." By now, other passengers were listening intently. The security checkpoint had that strange quality that public spaces get when something significant is happening. Conversations stopped, phone calls were put on hold, and people began gravitating toward the unfolding scene. An elderly woman named Dorothy, traveling to see her grandchildren in Arizona, moved closer. She'd noticed the commotion and wondered what was wrong. Next to her, a young businessman named Marcus, who'd been impatiently checking his phone, suddenly found himself captivated by what he was hearing. Behind them, a mother named Jennifer instinctively pulled her 2 young children closer, sensing that they were witnessing something important. Jim collected his belongings from the plastic bin, his movements still methodical and unhurried. He'd been through enough of these situations to know that drawing more attention wasn't helpful. He just wanted to get to his gate, catch his flight, and meet his new grandson. "Thanks, Sergeant," he said to Torres, recognizing the man's military bearing. He didn't even look at Tyler, not out of anger, but because he simply wanted to move on with his day. "Colonel, please wait," Torres said. "Please." The terminal wasn't packed at this hour, but there were enough witnesses for what happened next. Torres slowly approached and extended his hand to Jim, his gesture formal and respectful. "Thank you for your service, sir, and I apologize for how you were treated here today." This simple gesture drew more attention from nearby travelers. Dorothy, the elderly woman, approached cautiously. "Excuse me, what's going on? Who is this gentleman?" Torres turned to address the small crowd that had begun to gather. This gentleman served 25 years as a fighter pilot in the U.S. Air Force. He flew combat missions in Vietnam and the Gulf War. After being shot down and losing his leg, he fought to return to active duty and continued serving his country. The weight of Torres' words settled over the group like a blanket. Dorothy's eyes filled with tears. Her husband had served in Korea, and she understood the sacrifice that military families made. "Son," she said to Tyler, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd raised 4 children and buried a husband, "how could you treat this man so poorly?" Marcus, the businessman, stepped forward. He was dressed in an expensive suit and had been irritated about potentially missing his connecting flight. But now he felt small and ashamed of his impatience. "Sir," he said to Jim, "I live in Phoenix. I remember reading about you in the early 90s. The Arizona Republic ran a story about the pilot with the prosthetic who kept flying. Are you that pilot?" Jim nodded modestly, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. Jennifer, the mother, had been trying to explain to her children what was happening. Her 6-year-old son had asked why everyone was talking to the old man, and she'd struggled to find age-appropriate words to explain the concept of military service and sacrifice. Another TSA supervisor, Linda Walsh, approached after hearing the commotion from across the checkpoint. Torres quickly explained the situation, and Linda's expression changed immediately. She was a 15-year TSA veteran and the daughter of a Vietnam veteran. She knew exactly who Colonel Mitchell was. "Oh my God, Colonel Mitchell," she said. "Sir, I am so sorry about this. Everyone in aviation security knows your story. Your case study is literally part of our training materials for handling passengers with prosthetics." Now a small crowd had formed, maybe 20 or 30 people, who had either witnessed the original incident or been drawn by the growing commotion. Tyler stood off to the side, not knowing what to do. He was overwhelmed with shame and confusion. In 8 months on the job, nobody had ever explained to him that some of the passengers he was screening might be heroes. A young woman, college-aged and wearing a Colorado University sweatshirt, stepped forward boldly. Her name was Ashley, and she was studying journalism. She'd been raised by a single mother and had always been taught to speak up when she saw injustice. "Sir," she said to Jim, "I'm sorry you were disrespected today. Those of us in my generation don't know much about what veterans like you went through, but we want to learn. We need to learn." Jim smiled for the first time since the ordeal began. "That's all right, sweetheart. What matters is that you're asking the right questions and treating people with kindness." Tyler finally gathered the courage to approach. His eyes were wet and his hands were shaking. The magnitude of his mistake was finally sinking in. This wasn't just about following procedures or moving passengers through the line efficiently. This was about recognizing the humanity and dignity in every person he encountered. "Colonel," Tyler said, his voice barely audible, "I'm truly sorry. If I had known." Jim looked at him steadily. There was no anger in his eyes, no desire for revenge or public humiliation, just the patient understanding of someone who'd seen young people make mistakes.
and had learned that education was more powerful than punishment. Son, Jim said quietly, you were doing your job. Nobody's at fault here. But remember this, every person who walks through that checkpoint has a story. Some stories are bigger than others, but everyone deserves to be treated with basic human dignity. How can I make this right? Tyler asked. Next time, just be a little kinder, Jim said simply. Assume that the person in front of you might be fighting a battle you can't see. That's all. Torres stepped in. Tyler, I'm going to escort the colonel to the United Club lounge. Can you handle the checkpoint? That's not necessary, Jim protested. I don't need special treatment. Yes, sir, it is necessary, Torres said firmly. At this airport, you're our honored guest. As the crowd began to disperse, everyone knew they'd witnessed something they wouldn't forget. Dorothy took her grandson's hand. He'd been traveling with her to Phoenix, and said, "Did you see that? Did you see how you should treat people, especially those who've served our country?" Marcus pulled out his phone, but not to check his emails or stock prices. Instead, he called his wife. "Honey, you won't believe what just happened at the airport," he said, beginning to recount the story. Ashley, the journalism student, pulled out her notebook and began writing. This was the kind of story that needed to be told, she thought. Not for the drama or the conflict, but for the lesson about respect and recognition. As Jim walked toward the United Club with Torres beside him, the word was already spreading throughout the airport. Gate agents, flight attendants, and other TSA employees were hearing about what had happened at Checkpoint B. Stories like this traveled fast in the tight-knit world of aviation. "Colonel, I have to ask," Torres said as they walked. "How did you manage to convince the Air Force to let you keep flying with a prosthetic?" "Stubbornness, mostly," Jim said, with a slight smile. "And the fact that I could still do the job. I had to prove to them that losing my leg didn't make me any less capable of flying a fighter jet." "Was it hard? Getting back in the cockpit, I mean?" Jim paused, considering his answer. "The hardest part wasn't the physical challenge. It was seeing the worry in my squadron mates' eyes. Not worry for me, but for themselves. Every time they looked at me, they were reminded that it could happen to them too. I had to show them that fear wouldn't ground us, that we could still do our job even if the worst happened. And you succeeded. I had to succeed. Because those skies belong to America, and somebody had to protect them. If I let fear or disability stop me from doing my duty." What message would that send to the younger pilots? When they reached the United Club, Torres explained the situation to the attendant, a professional woman named Sarah who immediately understood the significance of their guest. She gave Jim the full VIP treatment, complimentary drinks, a comfortable seat by the window with a clear view of the runways, premium snacks, and access to the club's business center if he needed anything. Colonel, Sarah said, "I see your flight is delayed about 30 minutes due to air traffic control. I can arrange an upgrade to first class if you'd like, or see if we can get you on an earlier flight." "This is fine," Jim said, settling into a leather chair near the window. "I'm very comfortable here, and I'm not in any rush." Other passengers in the lounge had heard whispers about what had happened at security. A retired Marine named Frank, traveling to a reunion in Tucson, approached Jim respectfully. "Colonel," Frank said, "I served in Desert Storm, Ground Forces, 1st Armored Division. What you Air Force guys did made our job possible. We could hear your F-16s overhead, and we knew we were covered." "Everyone did their part," Jim replied. "Your job on the ground was a hell of a lot harder than anything we did up in the air. We just pointed and shot. You guys had to live in that sandbox and deal with the real danger." A flight attendant named Maria, who'd been working for United for over 20 years, overheard the conversation and approached. "Colonel Mitchell, I've heard your story before. My brother was a crew chief on F-16 set.
at Hill Air Force Base in the 90s. He always talked about the pilot with the prosthetic leg who refused to quit. Word was spreading beyond the United Club now. The airport manager, Robert Chen, who had been monitoring the morning's security reports, heard about the incident and immediately came to the lounge to personally apologize.
"Colonel Mitchell," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Robert Chen, the airport manager. We're deeply sorry for the treatment you received at our security checkpoint.
That behavior doesn't represent the values of Denver International Airport or the respect we have for our military veterans. Please don't discipline that young man too harshly,"
Jim requested. He was doing his job as he understood it.
Maybe this experience will teach him something valuable about looking beyond the surface.
Meanwhile, back at the security checkpoint, Tyler was having the worst day of his career. But also potentially the most important. His supervisor, Linda Walsh, had pulled him aside for a conversation that would stick with him for the rest of his life. "Tyler," she said, "I'm not going to write you up or put anything negative in your file, but I want you to understand what happened here today. That man you treated like a problem, he's the reason you can sleep safely at night. He and thousands of others like him put their lives on the line so that you could have the freedom to complain about your student loans and worry about your next promotion." Tyler nodded, still processing everything that had happened. "I just don't understand how I was supposed to know. He looked like any other passenger." "That's exactly the point," Linda explained. "Heroes don't wear capes or announce themselves. They look like ordinary people because that's what they choose to be. Your job isn't to identify heroes. It's to treat every single passenger with the respect and dignity they deserve as human beings." That evening, Tyler went home to his small apartment and did something he'd never done before. He researched Colonel James Mitchell online. What he found overwhelmed him. Articles from the early 1990s told the story of a fighter pilot who'd been shot down during a classified mission over Iraq. The details were sketchy. Much of his service record was still classified, but the broad strokes were clear. After losing his leg in the crash, Mitchell had spent months in rehabilitation, not just learning to walk again, but fighting for the right to continue his military career. The Air Force had wanted to retire him on medical disability, standard procedure, but Mitchell had appealed, undergone extensive testing, and somehow convinced military doctors and bureaucrats that he could still perform his duties as a combat pilot. There were photos of him standing next to his F-16, looking impossibly young and determined. Articles described him as quietly stubborn and unwilling to let his injury define his service. One piece quoted a fellow pilot saying Jim never talked about what happened to him over there. He just strapped on that prosthetic leg and got back in the cockpit like nothing had changed. Tyler found video footage from a ceremony in 1995 where Mitchell had been honored at his retirement. He'd served 3 more years after losing his leg, flying missions that he still couldn't talk about. In the video, he looked uncomfortable with the attention,
deflecting praise to other service members and talking about duty rather than heroism. The next morning, Tyler arrived at work early. He'd barely slept, spending most of the night reading about military service and trying to understand the magnitude of what he'd witnessed. When his shift started, he approached every passenger differently. "Good morning, ma'am. How can I help you today?" he said to an elderly woman traveling to visit her grandchildren. The question wasn't just procedural anymore. It carried genuine warmth and respect. "Good morning, sir. Thank you for choosing to fly with us today," he said to a businessman who seemed impatient with the security process. Tyler realized that he had no idea what stresses or challenges this man might be facing. When Jim's flight finally boarded 2 hours later, he settled into his window seat and looked out at the clouds as they climbed to altitude. The familiar sight of the earth falling away below brought back memories of countless flights in military aircraft. but he felt no pain or regret. He was proud of his service, proud of the men and women he'd served with, and proud that the next generation was slowly learning to recognize and honor sacrifice. As the plane reached cruising altitude, he thought about his grandson whom he'd meet for the first time in just a few hours. The baby would grow up in a world protected by a new generation of warriors, and hopefully, he'd learn to recognize and respect the quiet heroes who walked among us. Sarah, his daughter, had texted him the night before. "Dad, I can't wait for you to meet little James. We named him after his grandfather." The baby carried his name, and someday, Jim hoped, he'd carry forward the values of service and sacrifice that had defined Jim's generation. Down in Denver, the story of what had happened at the security checkpoint was spreading. Ashley, the journalism student, had written about it for her university newspaper. Dorothy had called her daughter in Phoenix to tell her about the wonderful man she'd met at the airport. Marcus had shared the story at his office, prompting several colleagues to talk about their own family members who'd served in the military. And Tyler began treating every passenger as if they might be carrying an invisible story of service, sacrifice, or struggle. He'd learned that respect wasn't something to be earned through recognition. It was something to be given freely, because everyone carried battles that others couldn't see. Colonel James "Iron Leg" Mitchell arrived in Phoenix, hugged his daughter, and met his grandson without ever mentioning what had happened at the airport. Because that's what silent heroes do. They don't talk about their service or seek recognition for their sacrifices. They just live their values quietly, every single day. But the impact of that morning at Denver International Airport rippled outward in ways that Jim would never know. Tyler became known among his colleagues as the agent who treated every passenger with exceptional courtesy. Dorothy started volunteering at a veterans organization in her hometown. Ashley wrote her senior thesis on the invisible veterans in American society. And somewhere in a VFW hall in Colorado, Torres told the story to other veterans, adding another chapter to the legend of Iron Leg Mitchell. Not about his combat missions or his determination to keep flying, but about his grace under pressure and his willingness to educate rather than condemn. So now I ask you, have you ever encountered someone like Colonel Mitchell? Someone who served quietly, never seeking recognition, but whose story deserved to be told? Share their name in the comments. Tell us how they lived their silent heroism. Because here at Silent Hero Stories, we believe that the most powerful stories don't shout for attention. They wait patiently for someone to notice. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, share it, subscribe, and help us keep these voices alive. We'll see you in the next story. And until then, if you ever see someone being treated unfairly, remember Colonel Mitchell and speak up. Because sometimes silent heroes need others to find their voice.